I think I could literally go into a bank with a gun. I'm like, 你把这钱放这个袋子. They're like, what? 这我说的是.
Hey guys, just a quick note from the editor, which is that this video is a little bit longer than my typical videos, just because the conversation that we had was so interesting that I just wanted to keep all the content in there. It kind of works more as like a podcast, a really interesting long-form conversation about cross-cultural comedy, what it's like doing comedy in Chinese for people in China, what it's like living in Beijing for almost a decade as an American, and how you can get your language abilities up to what it takes to perform live on-stage comedy in China. So definitely recommend setting some time aside to listen to the whole thing in full. And but I promise it's a super interesting conversation, and I had such an amazing time making this video, so I really hope you guys enjoyed it. And without further ado, let's get back to the video.
3, 2, 1, what's going on everybody? It's Xiaomanyc, and we are here today in a different place. This is my friend Jesse.
Hello, guys.
Hey, and today we've come all the way to Boston just to meet with you because I think Jesse has the most incredible story, and we've known each other for a while, but you know, because you live in Boston and I live in New York, it's like hard for us to chat. But
well, I live in Beijing usually, so I'm here because of the coronavirus. I live in Beijing, and I was coming back home to America for Chinese New Year to see my family. While I was here, the virus got really bad, and now I can't go back. So I'm kind of like a weird, like, first world refugee.
You're stuck in Boston. Stuck in Boston for now, which is great because we have the chance to talk with you. But first, we're gonna go and do a little sit-down interview and talk a little bit about your life, because you're a freaking stand-up comedian with like some of the best Chinese that any foreigner in the world has. Right. Yeah. So Jesse does stand-up comedy in like insanely perfect Chinese in China for Chinese audiences. So it's a really interesting story. We're gonna talk a little bit about that. But first, we're gonna get some food, and being back in America, like what is the food like?
Oh my God. Well, first of all, there's too much of it. Because I was just talking about this. I would love to pay half of the money and get half of the food. That would be perfect.
One other thing, real quick, guys. You may have noticed I got some merch going on right now. It's still kind of like in beta mode, still working out like a little bit of kinks. But if you want to be one of the first ones to get your hands on this hot Xiaomanyc merch,
nice.
Pretty cool, right?
I like this. Yeah, Xiaomanyc.
Yeah, Xiaomanyc merch. We got this kind of design. We got a bunch of designs. We also got ones with like my Chinese channel name on it, which are really cool. They're like black and white, super dope. Oh, thank you. I got the food. Yeah.
Chocolate chips over here.
Also, if you do get it, I'd be really curious to see like what you think about it. So send me an email. You can find my email linked on my Instagram. Let's eat and then we'll go check. Yo, Jesse,
hey.
What's up, man? We got some tea here. Oh boy,
tea.
Dude, I didn't really know this, but you're like a huge tea fan. You have some crazy good tea over here.
Yeah, I'm pretty far gone.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, I was so when I was studying abroad in Beijing, I was trying to learn Chinese, and I found that a lot of young Chinese people actually just wanted to speak English to me. They didn't want to speak Chinese.
Right.
So I was like, what place can I go where I can speak Chinese all day and nobody speaks English? And I discovered the tea market in Beijing.
Hey.
Because all the people in the tea market are from like Fujian or from Yunnan or from these places that they don't speak that much English. And they just sit there all day and drink tea and chat.
Right.
And that was great. That's exactly what I wanted. So I went there originally just to talk, and then afterwards, when I went over and over and over again, I started paying attention to the tea.
Yeah.
And now I really can't go anywhere without it. So
how long have you been living in China for now?
I studied abroad there in 2010 for 6 months.
Yeah.
In 2011, going into my senior year, I did a 3-month internship. Yeah. And then I moved there after I graduated from college in 2012. Yeah. So that's like 7 years, 8 years if you count the time studying abroad. Wow. So it's like basically all of my adult life.
Wow, that's crazy. So what is it like living in China for so long and then coming back to America? Like what sort of reverse culture shock?
I hit that. I mean, the main thing is like my my life patterns and stuff get messed up, because in Beijing I'm used to kind of going out at night, and I have an electric bike, so I just scoot wherever I want. Right. And my home here is in the suburbs of Boston. You can't get anywhere in the suburbs without a car. So like lifestyle wise, I kind of have to drive everywhere now if I want to go somewhere, which is not something I'm used to. And then also, the food is different coming back to American food. I love American food. I love, I get to eat Italian food, Mexican food, all this really good, like Western food. But now, like, I'm missing the Chinese food again. It's only been like 2 weeks. So, if I'm here much longer, I'm going to have to learn how to cook Chinese food. And that's going to be bad.
Right.
I like when I'm in China, I learned how to cook Western food because the Chinese food is so good. And it's hard to find Western food. And so all the stuff I know how to cook is actually stuff I can get here at like other places now. So
So like your life in China, right, is like one of these crazy things where like, I'll put some clips in here for you guys to see, but like
clips.
He became the first non-Chinese professional xiangsheng artist in China.
I'm Jesse Appell. I'm an intercultural comedian. I create comedy in China. I run a comedy club. I do shows both live in Chinese and in English here in China and around the world. All right, everybody, 欢迎到周五的熬夜秀。
I would highly encourage all of you to go over to like Jesse's channel and check out some of the stuff that he does because like, I've seen some of your like routines and like, well, first of all, obviously the level of jokes and the comedy is really high, but also just in general, like your language abilities with Chinese are just like off the charts. Like just doing like crazy, like you have to have such perfect Chinese to be able to do.
Well, I wouldn't use the word perfect at all because that's not how it feels from my perspective.
Right.
I feel like the thing I learned about learning a language is like you get as good as the hardest thing you ask your language to do. So if the hardest thing you ask your language to do is order food, you'll be able to order food, but you won't be able to write a poem. But if you try to write a poem or do a joke or write a song, even though it may seem like, okay, I don't write songs for my living, why would I write a song? It's actually because trying to write a song in another language is so much harder that it drags your language level up. You might never get there, but it brings you above where you would have been. So for me, the Chinese that comes out in the shows, like if I have enough time to practice as much as I want, I can make my language not as good as the native speaker maybe, but good enough to do the comedy. And my challenge now is like, how do I get to the point where I can like, go up on an open mic and the first time doing a new joke, be able to get something out of it and not have to practice and practice and practice to be able to do a joke for the first time. And how to, the hardest thing I ever had to do with my language when it comes to comedy was back in 2017, in 2018, I was on like a knockoff version of SNL in Shanghai. So every week we had new celebrity guests, write all the sketches, act all the sketches, table read notes, second table read, into props, casting, like all that sort of stuff. And every week we do it again. And so it was hard to do that, but it was hard to write my stuff, but at least I wrote my stuff, so I had it in my head. But what was even harder is when the other writers were like, Jesse, come and act in this bit. Here's the script. And they would hand me a script of a comedy sketch I'd never seen before on a topic I probably didn't know anything about. And I had to sight read it while acting and playing the character. And that was just insanely difficult. And I didn't do that great of a job of it.
So how did you get into this whole thing? Like, well, first of all,
More tea?
Yeah, sure. Could you talk about like what is your job? Like, what do you
like, what do you
do?
doing?
Like, yes, obviously.
What are you doing?
If you click on the title, like, so you're just like a stand-up comedian in China, but like, what is that? Like, what do you perform?
Sure.
Like, how do you make money? Like, who are your audiences?
So
like?
what happened is, I studied abroad in Beijing, so kind of where it started.
And why did you get into China? Like, why do you care? Like,
well,
what
I was always, when I was a kid, I was interested in learning languages, and I always thought it was really cool. Like, there's a secret code. It's like,
me too. It's like everybody.
It's like, I would look at these old atlases, and I'd be like, oh wow, like look at this country. It looks really interesting, and I always had the idea that I wanted to at least travel abroad. I didn't necessarily at that time think of living abroad, but that kind of got me interested. And when I was learning languages in school, I learned a little Spanish, a little Chinese, and I knew that I wanted to study abroad, and going to China seemed more interesting than going to Spain. So sorry if you're from Spain, but
right.
but I thought it was I thought it would be cool to go. And then when I studied abroad, I learned, wow, like, you know, living in another country is also really interesting.
Really interesting. Yeah.
You know, there's all different culture, different foods, different fun things to do. Yeah. And, you know, in a place like China as well, there's a lot of places to travel. So that was always fun. And then when I graduated from university, I knew I wanted to try to find a way to go back to China. But I also, when I was all through high school and all through college, I did improv. So improv comedy, coming on stage, performing without a script, just making people laugh. And I did a little bit of stand-up, but mostly improv. Yeah. And in 2011, when I went to do an internship over the summer in China before I graduated, I found out that there was a Chinese improv scene. And so I started playing with the Chinese improv people, and I thought of doing a research project on Chinese comedy, whatever that is. Right. And luckily I had a teacher of mine at the time who was, his name is David Moser. Yeah. And he
I know.
So David Moser was one of the first Americans to learn the traditional Chinese comedy style, like xiangsheng, crosstalk. Yeah. And so he said, I have a comedy master who I studied with who does traditional Chinese comedy. Would you like to meet him? Of course, yes.
This is when you were in America?
This is when I was in China studying, doing an internship, preparing to go into my senior year. And so I met with Master Ding Guangquan, who is David Moser's comedy master and who I wound up apprenticing to for 6 years.
Wow. So you were apprenticing with a Chinese master of Chinese traditional comedy.
So I met this guy, and he said, if you want to study this, I can teach you. Wow. And I applied for it, and I got a Fulbright fellowship to go over and research this comedy. So I was actually lucky. I got a grant to go and study the comedy as a scholar, whatever that means. So basically,
the American government paid you.
The American government paid me to go study Chinese, and the Chinese government too, because they also paid for the critical language scholarship thing as well. Yeah. So basically, I got really lucky because I was able to do comedy for a full year and not need to worry about my income. I didn't make a lot of money, but I could pay rent and I could buy food, and I got to do comedy all day. And it was a huge breakthrough for me personally because I always loved doing comedy, but I don't think I ever had the guts to really say I'm going to do comedy. I always figured I would like get a job somewhere. Right. But after doing comedy for a year, I apprenticed with this master teacher, and Ding Guangquan is the only Chinese traditional crosstalk comedy master to take foreign disciples. This comedy style, it's a two-person comedy. You have two people on stage, you go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The Joker, there's a Joker and a straight man. The Joker is always on the audience's left. The straight man's always on the audience's right. And you have this routine that you come up with, which is scripted. But if you're good, you can also kind of improvise off of that script and come back onto the script. And doing this traditional comedy style was a ton of fun. And it was very, very linguistically challenging because the style of comedy is based off of being a language performance art. Right. So it's a
very technical style of comedy.
It's not like in stand-up there are lots of ways to be funny. Like you can speak like this, or you can be like like that could also be funny in stand-up, but in crosstalk and xiangsheng, you need to speak with the right 口齿清楚表演优美. You need to speak with the right way of talking, or else people will think you're a hack. Right. So that was a big challenge for the language. And I studied with Master Ding for a year on the Fulbright Fellowship, and then after the Fulbright Fellowship was over, I just discovered I was really enjoying it. And I knew I would regret it if I didn't at least try to make a living off of it, whatever that meant. And in the beginning, the first 2 years or so, it meant like, I would teach some improv comedy classes. I would do some shows here and there. I'd perform at a company party here and there, occasionally go on a TV show, but those didn't actually pay that much money. I did tours back here in America at colleges and high schools, and occasionally would win like a grant from an arts organization. And the first year or two was probably the hardest of the times. It didn't feel hard because I was having a lot of fun, and I was lucky that I was always able to make enough to pay for my rent and for my food. So, and then as things got better and I got better, and as the market for comedy in China kept expanding inside of China, the opportunities became more and more, and then the chance to perform on better TV shows started coming up. In the beginning, even very big TV shows were bad for stand-up because they didn't know what stand-up was. So unless I was doing the traditional style, if I wanted to do any Western comedy, they didn't know what it was, so they would shoot it wrong or edit it wrong.
Yeah.
And now I make most of my living and most of my time I spend on doing stand-up in Chinese.
Yeah.
And I ran a club in Beijing for 3.5 years, although the club we're moving right now, so I don't know exactly where it is yet, but ran the club called the U.S. China Comedy Center for 3.5 years in Beijing. And this year my plan is to start making internet videos. So go and follow the channel on YouTube, and then also if you have access to the Chinese channels, the Weibo, Douyin, and Bijan, Bilibili. I wind up posting on them more actually than YouTube because I am bad about getting to YouTube because it's blocked in China, so it's hard to upload.
So okay, so you're doing comedy shows right now in China for like what kind, like who are, like, I mean, I guess I don't know. First of all, what do people think? Like you're just like a Chinese person. You're going out for a night on the town. You're going like is there like a stand-up comedy scene in China?
Yeah. So for me, the stand-up comedy scene has really grown. When I got there in 2012, the Chinese stand-up scene was like 6 people. Like literally, I knew them all. There was only 6 people. We would do one show a month, like one show a week. Yeah. At this one bar in Beijing, and the audience didn't know what stand-up was either, because stand-up in Chinese is translated as 脱口秀, talk show.
Talk show, yeah.
So any show that involves talking seems to fall under talk show.
Right. It's not. Doesn't mean.
So we would go and so they didn't know whether it was like stand-up or was it like the Ellen show.
Right.
So we would have people in the beginning. They're like, this guy, like, when do we bring on the guest? They're like, when, they wouldn't know what we were doing. And then we also weren't that good. Like, it's not like I moved to China and just because I happened to be born in America, I was naturally a gifted Chinese language stand-up comedian.
Right.
I wasn't that good either. So it was hard to get people to feel what it was. And then in around 2013, you started to have some TV shows in China that had something close to real stand-up on it. Yeah. And audience started to know what it was, so our underground scene started to grow because all of a sudden we could sell tickets. People would see it on TV, and they wanted to see it live, and the only people doing it live was us, the 8 people or whatever.
Gotcha.
So
are the others Chinese?
Yeah, they're all the other Chinese. There was an English scene, but the English scene and the Chinese scene didn't mix that much.
Okay.
So and now it's like, it's hard to believe it's only been 6 or 7 years, which seems like a long time, but is actually not that long of a time in terms of a development of an art form. Right. And now it's like every Friday I can do 3, 4, 5 shows in Beijing,
wow.
50 to 200 people for every show, just run from club to club to club to club.
That's crazy.
And like do these shows every Friday, every Saturday. And even cities like, second or third tier cities that might not have had a scene at all a couple years ago have a show once a week.
Wow.
That like if I want to travel to Hangzhou, I can do the Hangzhou show this weekend. If I want to go to like Wuxi, I can go do a Wuxi show, and I can go do Nanjing show or stuff like that. So, but it is a little bit. It's when people see me, they're a little bit surprised because I'm in the Chinese scene. So there aren't other foreigners in the Chinese scene, really.
Right. You're the only person in China.
Yeah, so they don't go to the show. They don't go to the show to see a foreigner do stand-up, which is both good and bad for me. It's good because that's the real challenge. Like, there, especially in a country like China where people encourage foreigners to speak Chinese, it's actually not very difficult to get onto some sort of TV or program show because you look white, right. And then they want white people that speak Chinese on the show for who knows why. Yeah. But those shows are not like the audience doesn't come to those shows looking for content. They come to see foreigners speaking Chinese. Right. So the people who come to the stand-up shows come to see content. So that's good because it challenges you to get there. The challenge is you actually have to get there. Because if they came and they paid real money to see a real show, and you're giving them in their mind what they don't see as a real show, then they'll think that you got on the stage because they wanted a foreigner to help sell tickets, but then they have the opposite reaction where they're now disliking you for taking up stage time from somebody who would have been a real performer. Right. So it creates a little bit more pressure, but that's the stuff that helps you get better. Right. And then but I think it's good because stand-up is about having a perspective, and as a foreigner, people don't know what my perspective is, but they know that I'm going to have a perspective that's different from theirs, or they think that. So it creates an interesting tension when you do stand-up because they don't know what I'm going to say next, or they don't know necessarily what I think. Right. The counter to that is if I say something that they don't believe, they usually dismiss it. Right. But if I say something they do believe, it's interesting for them. Yeah.
So when you see like what kind of stuff works in, I don't know how much experience you have. Well, I guess you did improv in college, right? Mm-hmm. So like, what do you think? What kind of comedy?
I did improv in China too for 7 years. Like I did a Chinese improv troupe and everything.
Right. Oh wow.
Yeah, we performed every Friday for the last like 2 years up until the coronavirus conflict.
So what do you think? What kind of comedy do you think resonates with Chinese audiences, and how does that differ from what you think Americans or like Western audiences would be interested in?
I think the Chinese audience, they like hearing stuff that has to do with like everyday life and about stuff that has to do with their life directly. Right. Because in America we've seen 40, 50 years of stand-up, most people, if you're like a comedy fan in America, you've seen all the basic stuff at least once. Like, people don't really want to hear a stand-up routine about, like, you know, I had a bad date with my girlfriend. That seems like a really boring topic because it could work, but there's nothing inherently, like, it's not a unique topic. It's not like, you know, like, it's not like, oh, dating is an amputee or something like that. That seems like very, very unusual, and no one's ever heard that bit. Yeah. But in China, because they've never had stand-up before, literally no one's ever just heard somebody go on stage and tell a bad date story. Because right, you know, it's hard to get your head around. So this material that in America as a comedian we would say is hack or like taolu. Right. Like we would say it's hack to just do a story about a bad date, but nobody's ever really heard somebody go on and do a bad date story, and certainly no one's heard a bad date story from the American perspective. Although there are a lot of landmines there I need to dodge. Right. But so my problem in the beginning was I was coming up with stuff that I hadn't seen before. And that was like 3 levels too complicated for what the Chinese audience was looking for. Yeah. It's not that there aren't Chinese people that like that, because there are, but it certainly wasn't what they were expecting at their first stand-up show ever. Right. So that's one thing that I think is a little bit different, is you still need to do good jokes, but you can get away with doing topics that are a little bit more based off of life. And then the second thing is I think that American comedy has a lot to do with identity, and like whether that's race or whether that's whether that's like my life as a X or whatever. You know, if you're
Asian identity,
Asian identity, Jewish identity,
black, white,
Hispanic, you know, I was a bar worker or whatever. Yeah. You can do that in China. But people don't have that history of being interested in other people's identities. Right. And so they might like the joke, but they like it because they like you, not because they're interested in that idea of identity so much. Right. Whereas in America, people right now that's really in.
Well, in America, not just in stand-up comedy, but just in America in general. Like, I don't think necessarily, especially if you grew up in America. Like, I didn't realize this for the longest time. Like. Yeah. The concept of like race and identity and like gender, like these things are so core to who you are. Yeah. In America, that cultural concept doesn't necessarily translate to other parts of the world.
Well, it's funny because the people who do really good Chinese stand-up do find a way to dig, like the people I know in the scene that I really like, they do find a way to dig into what makes them unique. Because that's something about comedy that I think is universal, that if you can share yourself, and you can be honest about yourself, and usually that will have some sort of element of how am I different than you, or how am I the same as you. Sure. If you can get there, people like it. Yeah. But here it's almost like an automatic laugh. If you find the race joke that you can do, if you're Jewish, you do the Jewish jokes, you'll get there automatically. Right. And the challenge is there's also a flip side to this, which is that jokes here that might seem a little bit tame
Yeah.
I don't know the way to say it. The jokes here that might seem like it's not based heavily off of identity. It's not based heavily off of like race or something like that, or politics. It's actually hard to do those jokes in America because it just seems to not have an angle. Like, you can never sell Comedy Central. Yeah, you can never sell Comedy Central on doing a show just because it's funny.
Okay.
But there, if you're just funny enough, they're like, yeah, this is funny. This is really funny. Everyone's laughing. I don't care that it has no race edge. I don't care that it has no politics edge. If it's funny, you might get it on.
Yeah.
So if your goal is just to make people laugh, and you don't have, I mean, you say, if your goal is just to make people laugh, China is ironically a really good place to be doing comedy now. But if you have a political or social axe you want to grind, it's an awful place to do stuff because the system doesn't like that.
What kind of sensitivities do you run into as a foreigner doing comedy? Like, are there certain things, certain topics you don't want to touch?
Well, there's kind of two ways to look at that question. The first way is to say, what does the audience care about? Like, what is the audience actually sensitive about? And there are topics that people can be actually sensitive about. So if America and China are in bad relations and I bring this up directly, people will get upset.
Okay.
There are also topics that people are interested in, but I need to be careful around. Like, I can do jokes about being an American dating Chinese people, but I need to be careful. When I first did the jokes, I would say something as a setup, so I see a lot of foreigners dating Chinese people now, and the audience starting to get just a little bit uncomfortable. It wasn't that I couldn't talk about it, but it was like, it's like if you go on stage in America and see like, a lot of black people in this neighborhood, but they don't think it's a joke.
Right.
It's like actually just an observation. People would be like, oh, that's not, where are you going with this? Like, so it wasn't that you can't do it. It's just I needed to be more careful about that.
Right.
And then politics is interesting because the people at live shows are very interested to hear me do political jokes because that's what they think American comedy is. They're like, that's what he would be doing if he were in his country, is what they think.
Yeah.
Even though I just don't do political humor in general. Yeah. But people would be very interested to hear that, but no TV station would air it. So the problem is you kind of have this like Darwinian survival of the fittest. Like, if you're a political comedian in China, it doesn't matter how funny you are because you're just never going to get paid to do that.
Yeah.
So, and if you do stuff that's airable, not every comedian that does airable comedy makes it, but some of them will. And so some of them that do get on TV, and then the comedy on TV informs what people believe comedy is.
Right.
And so you wind up creating the type of comedy that's airable, even though not all the comedy needs to be to that standard. So,
can you do, like, at your live shows, do you do politics?
You could do stuff. I mean, so for me, as an American, I don't actually get to choose because whatever I say, it automatically becomes a political statement because of the way they look at me.
Yeah.
So if I say, I was really annoyed because the subway was broken down today, then people in the audience would be like, but the Chinese subway is better than the American subway, and actually you have no right. I'm like, whoa. I was just trying to make a joke about how I was having a rough day in transit, instead this turned into an international incident.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And that has nothing to do with me. That has to do with the way the audience perceives me.
Right.
And that changes based off of how the audience perceives the outside world in general. So I actually have a very limited choice in how I'm perceived.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't get around it. You just need to be aware of it. Like, if I think the audience is going to have that sort of problem, then I need to do a joke about how the American subway is bad first, get them to laugh at that, and say like, subway here better, but it's still not perfect. One time the subway broke down, and then they're like, that's fair.
Right. Easy.
The audience is like, the audience laughs at stuff that is true, but again, true to them. There's no absolute truth in the world.
Right.
So if the audience believes that the thing is true, they will be willing to laugh at it. If the audience doesn't believe it's true, it doesn't matter whether I think it's true.
Yeah.
So this was like, if I have a story about like, if I was trying to do a hot topic joke, and I do a hot topic joke about like, I read an article in the New York Times about blah, 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 blah. The most Chinese audience would not believe the New York Times does a good job of covering China. So it doesn't. So they're starting from this as being an untrue story.
Gotcha.
Whereas in America, if I just do a setup saying it was in the New York Times, people would think it's a true story.
Okay, so,
like,
the context is very different.
So the context is very different, and so I need to often find when something will happen to me in real life that I think is funny, and I'll write it down on my phone, and then later sometimes I might need to change the details of how I found out to fit the idea that the audience has. So Chinese people, if I learn something about Chinese culture, if I learned it myself, that isn't really believable.
Right.
But if a Chinese friend told me, it's very believable.
Oh, I see. Right.
So in actuality, learning is very complicated. Right. You never learn anything all by yourself. You have teachers. But your teachers, it's not just because they told you something you learn it. Yeah. So there's a mix and all these sort of things. But if you're creating a comedy show, that's very complicated. You sometimes will say, this thing really happened, but is there a way to make it a little bit cleaner so that it feels better as a comedy show? And I don't think that's cheating. I still think that's sharing my real life experience. It's just doing so in a way, like if you're writing a book, you wouldn't write stream of conscious. You would put it into paragraphs.
Right.
So it's there's a little bit of a challenge there, sure.
Do you so like with to return to the topic of language a little bit, like do Chinese people, does the average Chinese person like encounter foreigners who speak Chinese at the level that you speak at it on a daily basis? And like, are people ever surprised when you get up there, on stage and you're speaking in like obviously pretty advanced Chinese? Like, is that ever shocking to an audience? Like, do people ever come up to you afterwards and ask like, where did you learn Chinese? Like,
well, I have this joke that I do as one of my openers where I talk about that I've discovered like the first sentence I say to somebody in China has no bearing on what they say back to me. Because like I could be like, ni hao, or like 你是不是谁的朋友? And then the every time like 哇你中文说得这么好, like I could say anything. Right. I have the joke. I'm like I think I could literally go into a bank with a gun. I'm like 把这钱把这个袋子. They're like 哇中文说得真好. You're like.
Right. There you go.
在中国待了几年啊？
学了多久啊？
会用筷子吗? Like,
Right. Wow.
So, and I did that joke on TV show,
right.
And it works really well because people know that it's true. Now, as somebody who actually lives in the country, if I'm in a good mood, I like this because people are being nice.
Yeah, right.
People are being nice and they want to thank you. If I'm in a bad mood, I'm like, oh, this is really depressing because it doesn't matter how good I get, no one's listening. So like, and similarly as a comedian, I want you to think the joke is funny. I don't want you to think, wow, your Chinese is so good. I want you to think, like, if you're a chef, you want people to say the food is good. You won't want them to say like, wow, you chopped the onions so fine. Like, if I'm funny, I'd like that to come through the joke. And if people are talking about my language, it's not always perfect. But, as an entertainer, the first step is to get people interested. Because if people aren't interested, they won't watch. And so if people are interested because of the language, I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
If people watch half an hour of my show and they come away with, oh, wow, his Chinese is good, then I haven't done a very good job as a comedian. But if they watch 2 minutes of my show and they come away with that, then I think that's fine. And I think it's also fun because, like, when I was learning Chinese, starting to make jokes, and I'm not talking about professional, I had no idea it would be part of my job, just like starting to make jokes and regaining this aspect of my personality that I had in English and trying to do jokes in Chinese was like a big breakthrough, because once I started like making jokes and trying to like live with it, all of a sudden something clicked where I was like, this isn't just something that I study and I get grades and like maybe I get better and it's like on a resume somewhere. Like this is I like talking to people. Now I have this whole group of people that I can make laugh that I couldn't have reached before. Right. And that was the fun of learning the language. And it went from being a testing thing where I want to get good grades to being if I get better at this, my life just gets better.
Yeah.
And so that was a big change for me. And then it turned out that I wound up doing it for a living.
How do you get from not knowing any Chinese to being fluent enough in the language to be able to do like stand-up comedy in Chinese?
I think there's a couple things that are useful. One is like you just have to speak. Like there's no other way around it. Like I meet people who, even people who are like, doing master's and doctorate degrees in Chinese that are still afraid to speak.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Like they'll just avoid ordering food on the phone and they'll do it through the app because they can text, and it's like, you need the good and the bad is, you need to get over that. The good is it's actually easier to get over than you think. The bad is that it's going to be hard, and like for everybody, it's always hard to get over that hump.
Right.
It's like there's nobody who's like so good at this that it comes easy. Yep. Like it wasn't easy to get over the hump. Luckily, I'm such a a blabbermouth that I would have gone crazy if I didn't speak Chinese while I lived in China.
Yeah.
It's a little bit harder if you live here to figure out a way to do it, but any way that you can actually open your mouth and speak is a good way. Right. I've recently been recommending to people just make a podcast in the other language. Doesn't even matter if you share it.
Oh, wow.
Just go on and talk about a topic for 20-something minutes into a recorder and do it once a week. At least you had 20 more minutes of speaking time. Like there's
it's interesting.
There's like lots of ways that you can trick yourself into speaking. The other thing is I would say like a lot of times people get really caught up on like what's the best way to study, like or what about these flashcards, or what about the app, or like what if I use the textbook, or what if I watch a movie, like which one's better, what's the most effective way of using my time. And the real answer is like in order to get really good at anything, you just have to put in a lot of time anyway. Yeah. And so I don't really think it matters maximizing another 20 or 30% efficiency and doing this technique or that technique. Yeah. It's like when anything you will actually do is the best way of learning the language. Right, so like when I was in, like one of the things I did early was I would watch the Boston Celtics game, but I would go on the Chinese stream. Just because I want to watch the game anyway, but this way I can hear another 3 hours of Chinese, and I didn't understand really any of it at the beginning, but I was going to watch that game anyway. Yeah. So this was 3 hours of studying that didn't really even feel like studying. Right. And this was back when you could watch all the games pirated on Youku the next day, so it was a little bit easier. but there's tons of Chinese media. If you're watching a show you don't like just for language, it can feel a little bit hard. Yeah. But if you're gonna watch it anyway, if you're gonna watch the NFL or NBA, or you're gonna watch a shoe review video or a cooking video, just watch it in Chinese and just see what it is. And the other thing is in addition to speaking though, don't underestimate how important listening is. My xiangsheng master, he always says that the first step is listening. Because if you can't tell the difference between what you're saying and what they're saying, you can't speak correctly. You'll never be able to speak correctly because you're just taking blind guesses. Right. So if you listen to a lot of the language, and especially if you're listening closely, but even if you're just listening, all that's just going in your head somewhere. And then when you speak and you say like 美国, oh, that doesn't sound right. 美国, oh, that sounds right. You'll be able to make those... You'll be able to make those corrections easier later because you've heard that word 100 times at some point.
Do you have any tips for people, like you were talking about social anxiety? Like a lot of people are just like really afraid to just go out and try to speak to somebody, like worried that people are going to laugh at them, or like they're not going to be able to say what they want to say. Like, how do you kind of get over that?
I mean, I got over it with improv. So I went to improv in China and did it in the second language. Yeah. Like improv is great for social anxiety, period. Because you learn, like, improv is performing without a script. But the truth is, real life is also performing without a script. So if you're interested in learning how to do that better, the skills that you learn doing improv comedy are actually useful in everyday life. Yeah. And this is true for people who just want to go to a bar and do an improv workshop. And also part of my job, you ask how I make my money, part of my job is I do workshops for big companies in China that have Chinese employees and Western employees, and they need to get over this language and culture barrier. But really, it's not even language, it's just they're not comfortable working with each other. Right. And so you get people playing improv games, and even if they're really silly games, we use eye contact, we're listening, we're playing together, sometimes I touch you. Like this actually breaks down that barrier and it makes it a little bit easier. So if you have improv in your town, or your city, wherever you are, I would go and join that. And then if you don't have improv, I think that really, unless you want to be like a hardcore poet scholar or something like that, that's very, very written heavy, the purpose of language is to talk to people.
Yeah, pretty much.
So there has to be at some point, like, it's not like speaking, written, typing, like this, it's not all equal.
Yeah.
Like, I really think that if you find a way to speak to people, all the other stuff will come. But if you find a way to just learn how to write and read, it's not guaranteed the other stuff will come.
Yeah.
And so, you know, unless you are really specifically like, I want to study, like, you know, 15th century Buddhist poetry that no one's speaking, almost everything you need to at some point speak with people.
Yeah.
And then I think the other thing that's important is find an environment that's healthy. Like my comedy master, my master took Chinese disciples and foreign disciples. And I've been in Chinese classes and paid for very expensive programs sometimes, or got scholarships. And I've been in all sorts of language environments my whole life. No language environment was ever better than the one that he created for learning the crosstalk. Because you had foreigners from all around the world. We all spoke Chinese together because the thing we were learning was a Chinese thing, right, that it made sense to speak about in Chinese. Yeah. Similarly with the tea, when I go to the tea market, like, you know, nobody wants to say like lidded cup. We say gaiwan because that's what it is. Yeah. So there's no reason to speak English in that context. Like, you know, other places, just for instance, like in a previous job, I used to play basketball, pick up basketball with Chinese people every day after work. Like, I would learn a lot of words in that context because we would just be speaking on the court. Right. And all of these environments, they're very different, but what they had in common was it made sense. Yep. It didn't feel like I was forcing the language study in anywhere. And so I never found a language table or like a Chinese corner that I was really comfortable talking in. I'm not saying that they don't exist, because maybe people do have those, and if you're comfortable, it's the right place. Yeah. But for people that are not comfortable there, it means maybe try to find the place you are comfortable. Right. And if you're, you know, and the other thing is, I said, whatever you would have done anyway, find it in Chinese. If you're into makeup videos, watch the Chinese makeup videos. Leave a comment on the Chinese makeup videos. Leave a video response. People will be very happy to see the foreigners doing the Chinese makeup video as well. And people love that interaction, and you get points for the effort. You don't get points for being good. You get points for the effort. So if you make the effort, people will give you points. And so. And then I think the other thing is, this is the one last thing, is I think there's a combination of finding a way to have this mentality of having high standards for yourself, but not beating yourself up if you don't get there. Yeah. So if you have low standards for yourself, like, I just want to be able to order food, you'll get there pretty quick. Right. But the problem is you won't get any better. If you have high standards for yourself, I want to do jokes in Chinese. Yeah. You may not get there. The hard part, but you'll get much better at Chinese. The hard part then becomes thinking you're not a total failure because your joke didn't work. Yeah. You know? So if you want to make if you like basketball, like, make a podcast about basketball in Chinese. And then if it's not the best podcast ever, don't beat yourself up about it. Yeah. Because the point was not really to do the best podcast ever. Right. Once you get better, your standards can get higher, and your level will get higher. So.
Yeah. Best case scenario is some people start actually listening to your like you have no idea, like, you could just if you started even if with rudimentary Chinese, you can start making videos.
People would be very very supportive of that sort of thing with Chinese. Supportive, yeah. And I don't know about learning other languages as well. One of the reasons it's relatively easy to learn Chinese compared to some other European languages is that there are a lot of Chinese people that don't speak English. Right. And so they need to have somebody that speaks their language in order to communicate, or that you can speak a little bit of both. Right. Whereas, like, you know, I'd love to learn Icelandic, but all my Icelandic friends speak fantastic English.
Right, yeah, it's not very useful.
And so it's like, it's no
incentive to learn it.
It's no incentive to learn it. It's a little bit hard, and it's like, you know, and then where would you use it when you had it? But Chinese has none of these problems. There's very clear things that you can do that you could not have done before because you speak Chinese. Yeah. And there's, even if half the Chinese population one day speaks English fluently, there will still be 700 million people that don't.
That's a lot.
So like, you know, so there's going to be plenty of people that need this you to take the step out to learn. And I found that was helpful for me, because if everybody just spoke English when I got there and there was no value to learning the language, it would have been harder to learn. Yeah.
What's the craziest thing that ever happened to you at a stand-up show?
Stand-up show?
Or any show, like on TV?
The craziest show that ever happened, and I actually have a mini video blog about this that I made years ago, but one time I was doing a show on a cruise ship, and I was supposed to board the cruise ship in Japan, but my flight got canceled the day before, so I had to wait overnight, fly anywhere in Japan the next morning, take the bullet train all the way across the country to get to the port in time, because it was the only way I could get onto the ship in time. And I did all the math, and I'm like, if I don't miss any transfer, I'll get there with an hour to spare. Wow. And so I did all that. I flew the next morning. I took the bullet train across Japan. I don't speak Japanese, and so it was like, I was really hope I didn't get this wrong. I'm like, you know, Shinkansen, and I got there and I saw the ship in the port, and I ran up to the edge of the ship, and literally I touched the edge of the ship, and it goes, and it starts going out to sea.
Oh no!
And I realized that I had forgot to account for the time zone difference, so I lost an hour.
Oh shit!
So in my perfect scenario, I would have happened like literally the minute I get there, the ship would leave, which is what happened. And if you miss the ship, you're screwed. Like, that's going to the Pacific Ocean. Like, you're not getting on the ship. So I was screwed. I'm going to lose my job on the ship. They're never going to book me again. And right as this giant cruise ship, it's like 14 stories tall. It's the size of like a city. As this thing moves out, from behind it, this little boat comes out, and it's the Japanese Coast Guard. And they're like, who is this guy? And I'm like, I'm the comedian. Like, you know, I'm like, you know, like two Goku Mansai. I'm like, you know, like Chinese Mansai, 2-person xiangsheng. Like, they have no idea who I am, but they're like, he clearly wants to be on the ship. So they put me on their boat, and they start chasing down the big boat. Oof. And then we're going out to the ocean, and they pick up speed, and they come up right next to the boat, and on like it would be the 4th floor or whatever of the ship, they have like a porthole like way up off the ship that's meant to be accessed through a ramp, but it's just like 2 stories off from the water. And this guy like leans out, and he's like, who are you? I'm like, I'm the comedian. And they're like, what's your passport number? And I'm like yelling out this passport number, and they're like, yeah, you should be on the ship. So they're like, okay, come on in. And so as we're going out to sea, they pull a maneuver so the small boat comes up against the side of the big boat, and they throw down a ladder.
Oh my God.
And so I put my like, I have like a duffel bag, and I put it over my shoulder, and I start going up this ladder as the ocean's going underneath. It was like the like least interesting version of like Mission Impossible ever. But it was like, if I fall, like you're going in the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah.
At speed. And so I was like, don't look down. And I get up there, they scan my thing, and they're like, okay, your show's tomorrow. Like, go eat the buffet.
Holy shit.
And I managed to make the ship. And that was probably the craziest thing that's ever happened in terms of making a show.
Wow.
And so, you know, but that's the thing. Master Ding has always says your job as a performer is not really even to do well. It's first to be there. Because they have a show, they have a whole bunch of people waiting to see a show. If you do a bad show, at least that you were there on the stage eating up the time. Right. But if then you want to do a good show. But if you don't show up at all, then they're screwed and you never get booked again. Yeah. And so that was ridiculous. I have a great picture of the ship out to sea, which is the picture I show when I say I do cruise ships, and I show this cruise ship, and they're like, wow, it's so enormous. I'm like, but you notice that ship is out to sea. How did I get this picture? You would have to be, say, on a Coast Guard boat chasing down the other boat in order to get that picture, which is how I had the picture. So
yeah, that's amazing.
It was a truly bizarre experience.
Yeah. And then do you find what you do to be rewarding? Like,
oh yeah. It's rewarding on many levels. I mean, one, just being able to make people laugh is a great job. Like, people are stressed. They all work jobs that they don't necessarily like. Yeah. They get to come and go to the theater and see a show and laugh and enjoy themselves, and you're there in the middle of it. Like, when you're doing comedy well, it's like it's so great, rewarding for me and rewarding for them. They get to relax, and then doing it in another culture and another language is also very rewarding because I get to be this cultural ambassador. Like, because Chinese people don't get a chance to interact with too many Americans, really, and so it's not exaggeration to say, like, if you, as an American, if I can make Chinese people laugh, it changes the way that they look at America.
Right.
And if I can do it in their language about stuff that's important to them, you don't even need to say that. I don't need to say, like, I am a cultural ambassador, and I'm not. People just get it. And so, and because comedy comes from real life, when I talk about my real life, even if it's a little different here or there, people realize that, like, oh yeah, they're just people like us. And similarly, when I do comedy about China in America, it might be a little different, but people are fundamentally, they say, like, oh yeah, I understand this. Yeah. And so that sort of work, if I do it well, I think has a lot of value, and I find it very rewarding. Yeah. And then there's stuff like, as well, people learning languages. I've had people who have been learning Chinese or say, like, oh, I saw your videos online, and it let me know that, like, oh, it is possible to learn this language. Yeah. And that feels really good. Even people that I never expected. Like, I did, I don't know if I told you this story. I did a stand-up show on the xiangsheng, on the Chinese bridge show. I wasn't a contestant, but I was doing stand-up on the show for the contestants of the xiangsheng, which is like a language competition.
Right,
so
for foreigners who will compete to learn.
Yeah, so the foreigners should compete to learn the language, which language competitions of themselves, whatever. But the program had all these people that were learning Chinese, and this one guy, I remember doing the show, and I saw off to my right, there was this one guy from Ghana who was, like, really into the show. And I was like, oh, I don't know why he's so into it. I mean, I guess it's good jokes, but still, I didn't know why he was so into it. And then after the show, as I was preparing to leave, he, like, runs up and tells me, he's like, oh, this is so great. Like, I'm so glad I actually got to meet you. I saw your videos on YouTube. Like, I'm from Ghana, and I do comedy in Ghana, and I never thought to put them together. And that got me really excited to learn more Chinese and see if I can do comedy in Chinese. And I was like, who would have thought that putting up a video of me doing a Chinese comedy video would have reached this person in Ghana? That was, like, the best thing that happened to me all year. Wow. So, like, so that's very rewarding as well. And part of the challenge for me is trying to remember, like, hey, like, look, if it doesn't, you know, if you get 1,000 hits or 10,000 hits or 100,000 hits, like, it's not like your value as a human being is determined by how many hits your video gets. Although my income might be, but my value as a human being doesn't really matter based off of that. And if you're helping people, you're helping people, and helping one person is good, even if it's helping one person, you know. So
sweet, man. Well, I mean, that's really amazing, and thank you so much for sharing your experience with me and you know, the audience, and I'm sure people will be interested in. Where can they find you on social media?
Oh, I'm scattered all over the place. So you can find me on all of the U.S. and Chinese social media stuff. My we'll pop them up right here. Okay, so the YouTube is Jesse Appell. The Instagram is @whatshesaid. The Chinese sites on Douyin, I think I'm 美国脱口秀演员艾杰西, but you can only access that on the Chinese version of Douyin. Right. The Weibo is @艾杰西. And the Bilibili, I think I'm like 爱笑的艾杰西. I've done a really bad job of getting these aligned.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
So.
Sweet. Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's it, man.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right.
Awesome.
Cool. Have a good one, guys.
Bye bye.